This is the Comics Alternative Manga, finishing up Monster, Otherworld Barbara, and other manga series. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys who either have advanced degrees or are getting advanced degrees really liking manga. And on the April manga episode, yep, that's right, you heard correctly, the April manga episode, Shea and I are going to do something we've been wanting to do for a while. We're going to follow up on some of those series that we started off previously in past episodes reading and talk about our completion of those series. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
And you can always get manga there, too. You can get volumes of books like Mitsuru Adachi's Cross Game for 30% off, and books like Sailor Moon for 25% off.
That's right. You know, whether you like your comics in manga form or otherwise, you really can't beat the great prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your manga there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. Well, Shea, before we get into the April show, maybe a couple of words of explanation, but also sharing some listener correspondence. I said that this is the April show, although we're in the beginning days of May. At this point, it's our listeners may know that it's not unusual for us, you and I, to be a little late on the manga shows. We try not to be. This time around, though, there is a good reason for it, and it's because of your education.
You've had a difficult time figuring out what kind of two guys we are since I started my PhD program. But I am, in just a few days, I'll be done with the first year. So this April episode happened to coincide with the end of my first year of grad school, which is a particularly hectic time. So we are a little late getting to the April episode, but we will try and be a little better about punctuality in the future. Hopefully, we'll get back on track with the May episode.
Right, and in fact, late this month, May, Shea and I should come out with our May manga episode. And in fact, we already know exactly what we're going to be discussing on that show. So we have no excuse for being as late as we are this time.
No. And it'll be nice to be able to do it on time rather than be busy with all of these other stressful, hectic things.
That's right. Well, Shea, before we get into the core of this month's episode, or actually last month's episode, let's share some listener correspondence with everyone.
Mail time. Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
And this is a message that we got via YouTube, and it's from someone who has corresponded with us in the past, David Wimbiga. And again, I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name, David. Please correct me. He's responding to our show, our last episode, which went up in March, and he says, "Excellent. A pleasure, and thanks for the shout out because we mentioned him on that episode. He goes on to say, since you seem to appreciate much of the same manga, I'm sure you want to check out Aya Takano, 3 manga in English. And these are the titles: Cosmic Juice, Spaceship EE, and The Jelly Civilization Chronicle. So thank you once again, David, for your messages. We do appreciate the feedback. And Shea, do you know about these books? Are you familiar with the ones from Aya Takano that David mentioned?
No, I was going to say thank you to David. I'm familiar with, if it's the same Takano that I'm familiar with, I'm familiar with her work. She's a fine artist. She's a painter who's part of this Japanese art movement in the mid 2000s or the 90s and mid 2000s called Super Flat, where this guy Takeshi Murakami was the big name out of that movement. But she was associated with it as well, and so I'm kind of familiar with her painting through that, and I am a fan, and I had no idea that she did manga. So I was interested to learn about these, and I am definitely going to try and track them down and check them out. Yeah,
I think they would be worth checking out. So we definitely appreciate the recommendations, David. Okay, let's get into the meat and potatoes of this episode of the Manga Show. And as I said in the opening, what Shea and I are going to be doing now is we've picked 2 series that we discussed on the Manga Show in the past. And we either we discussed either the first volume or, in one case, I think the first 5 volumes of this series. And we just thought it would be a good idea to kind of go back and follow up on these 2 series, and having completed them, kind of talk about what our reaction is now that these series are complete, and how that may compare to our initial reaction when we first discussed them on earlier episodes of the manga series. And Shea and I decided to look at 2 series, only 2, because it was a ton of reading. We're going to begin by talking about Naoki Urasawa's Monster. And we first talked about Monster, I think it was the first 5 volumes, in July of 2015. So that's almost 3 years ago, Shea.
Yeah, I was just looking at that date, scrolling down through past episodes myself, and I was kind of floored that it had been so long, that we had been doing this show for so long, let alone we have a series from all the way back then to talk about once again.
Yes. So we did talk about the first 5 volumes of Urasawa's Monster almost 3 years ago. So we're going to talk about the complete series now as best as we can. And then the other series that we're going to be discussing is Otherworld Barbara, specifically Volume 2 of Otherworld Barbara, which completes it. Now, we talked about Volume 1 of Otherworld Barbara back in September of 2016. So it's not been quite 2 years, but it's been long enough to where I had to go back and reread the first Otherworld Barbara book before I read the second volume.
Yeah, it's I actually recalled enough of the plot that I was able to read the nice recap page on the inside of the second volume to read it. But yeah, I did have to afterwards. I went back and quickly read the first volume because there was quite a bit of the details that I had forgotten as well.
Mm-hmm. And now this is something that Shea and I have been discussing as a possible episode for quite a number of months now, right?
Yeah, it's something we've definitely been kind of, I can't recall, how long we've been talking about it, but it's been something we've been wanting to do for a little while now.
Yeah, I do remember that toward the end of last year is when we first broached this topic, and we thought, oh, wouldn't this be an interesting episode, kind of to follow up on some of the series that we say that we want to read. Because one of the things that Shea and I do whenever we discuss, let's say, a volume, the first one or two volumes of a series, you know, Shea, you and I ask each other, are you going to go ahead? Are you going to go on and continue reading? Because sometimes we review books on the manga show that are, for all practical purposes, done in one. And we do a lot of those, but we also do quite a number of, let's say, initial volumes in what's going to be an ongoing series. And we always comment that, you know, yeah, I'm going to continue reading this series, or I don't know if I'm going to or not. And so I just wanted to see how we actually did follow up. And I can tell you, I haven't been as diligent in terms of keeping up with series as I say I want to be on these manga shows. But I think another thing that caused us to go ahead and do this episode for April, so to speak, is that the nominees for the 2018 Eisner Awards came out. And we noticed that of the 5 nominations under the Best U.S. Edition of International Material Asia, 3 of those are books that we've discussed on the manga show. And those are Golden Kamui, My Brother's Husband, Volume 1, and then Otherworld Barbara, Volume 2 is the one that is nominated for the 2018 Eisner Award. And so we thought, since Otherworld Barbara Volume 2 is being nominated, this may be an opportune time for us to discuss it on the show, because Otherworld Barbara is one of those series that we did decide we wanted to follow up on.
Yeah, I hadn't gotten a chance to see the Eisners, but this is at least the second year in a row that we've been tastemakers. We've had a number of the nominees. We've featured them before their nomination, so it's good to know that we are continuing the trend of reading the finest manga available.
Yes, and you know, if you look through, and if you haven't seen that list yet, Shea, you ought to take a look at it online, because a good number of nominees under the various categories for this year are books that we've discussed on the Comics Alternative in one form or another. I mean, obviously, those 3 books under the Best U.S. Edition International Material Asia, we discussed 3 of those works of manga. But throughout the other categories, whether it was on our Euro Comic show, our regular review show, or creators that we interviewed, or even the Young Readers series, I would say a good half of the nominations of the Eisner Awards for this year we've discussed on the show in one form or another over the past year.
That's the Comics Alternative bum.
That's right. Yeah, we are truly, as you put it, tastemakers. But enough patting ourselves on the shoulder. Let's go ahead and begin talking about that first title that Shea and I are following up on, and this is Naoki Urasawa's Monster. Again, we first discussed this in July 2015 on that episode, and at the time, I think 5 volumes of Urasawa's Monster in perfect edition had come out. Now we have the series completed, and so it goes to 9. And both of us now have completed Monster. Now, Shea, I don't know when you finished reading Monster, but for me, I finished up Monster a little more than a year ago. And so one of the things I had to do is to go back and somewhat refresh myself on the storyline, because I'd forgotten a bit of it. I mean, I remembered, I guess, the core of what goes on in Monster. But again, since it had been over a year since I completed everything, I felt like I needed to refresh things and catch up a little bit. How about you? When did you finish up the series?
Well, you know, Monster is one of the few titles that I actually have I've done a good job of actually continuing to pick up as it continued along after we talked about it. But until a couple days ago, I had the entire series. I'm sure I finished purchasing it around the same time that you did, but I actually hadn't been reading it that whole time. So I got to go and reread parts of those first 5 volumes to refresh my memory. Because like you said, it had been quite a while since I had taken a look at them. But I finished reading the ninth volume of Monster yesterday. It's pretty fresh. It's pretty fresh for me. I didn't have to go back and revisit the end.
And something that you said that, Monster was, of course, one of those that you definitely wanted to keep up with after we initially discussed it on the show, not quite 3 years ago. I felt the same way, and I was really bowled over by Urasawa's storytelling. And Monster was the very first thing that I had ever read by Urasawa. And so in the year or a little more since I completed Monster, I've more or less been on an occasional Urasawa kick. So since then, I went through and read through the Master Keaton series. And I think, and those are in perfect editions as well. And I think that there are 12 volumes of those. So I completed Master Keaton. And then after Master Keaton, I still couldn't get enough of Urasawa. So I read Pluto. And that was, compared to the other series, relatively shorter. I mean, it's still kind of longish, but I think there's 5 or 6 volumes, something like that, in VIZ's signature edition. And so I finished that up. And then right now, I am almost right in the middle of Urasawa's 20th Century Boys.
Oh, okay. I know we've talked, I'm sure we've chatted about it while we've been recording, but I know we've talked off air about Master Keaton a little bit, but you read Pluto a little more recently, and I saw you posting about it on Goodreads recently, and I didn't know you were reading 20th Century Boys. Why don't you can you tell me a little bit about how you're enjoying Pluto, especially as it compares to Monster? Like as you said, Pluto is considerably shorter. Are you finding that it's a stronger work, that Urasawa is able to pack more in a smaller amount of space, or do you think his work works better in these longer series?
I think in many ways it's like apples to oranges, because what he's doing in Monster, and even to some degree in Master Keaton, although Master Keaton is a very different kind of narrative strategy than let's say Monster or even Pluto, 20th Century Boys. What he's doing in Monster is quite different from what he did in Pluto, because Pluto, even though it was, again, relatively short and contained, it was nonetheless a tip of the pen and a heartfelt salute in many ways to Tezuka, because it's all about Astro Boy in one form or another. And there are overt references to Astro Boy. And so this is Urasawa's, I guess, tribute to Tezuka. And it's also his way of, to at least some degree, kind of rewriting at least the premise of Astro Boy. And so in that way, it's a completely different kind of narrative than Monster. Monster is his own creation, and also Pluto's a mystery in many ways, kind of like Monster is. Monster, though, is much more dark, violent to some degree. I mean, Pluto is very violent as well. But I think that there is, because it deals with Astro Boy in overt ways, there's something a little lighter, or at least definitely less dark than Monster. Although, I guess one could make the argument that there's a darkness to Pluto as well, but I don't think it's anywhere near the existential or even philosophical dark side that we see going on in Monster.
That's it's interesting to hear you say that, because I've heard, I know very little about Pluto. Like you mentioned, it's a kind of adaptation of this Astro Boy story, and it's a kind of homage or tribute to Tezuka. But other than that, I didn't really know. I don't really know much about it. But I'd always heard that, or the people I know who have read his longer works like Monster or 20th Century Boys, I've always seen Pluto kind of compared, how do I want to put this, unfavorably to the longer series. I've always heard Pluto as being his strongest work, because it is much more condensed, which I guess is a good segue into talking about Monster kind of specifically. I had always heard, as I mentioned, I have a number of friends who are big into manga, and they were kind of into Urasawa much before I was, and they had always told me that his work kind of dragged, especially these longer series like Monster or 20th Century Boys, or I think I've heard this about Billy Bat as well. That there's a lot of filler. There's a lot of chapters that really serve no larger narrative purpose. Things like that. It's very much like he just needed to fill pages. And reading the first 5 volumes, and I'm sure I mentioned this on the first podcast we did about the series, but I never really got that sense from the first 5 volumes. Maybe there was a couple chapters here or there that I felt really dragged, that were really fluff, really, just kind of waste of space, to be kind of harsh. But reading these last 4 volumes, I did really start to notice those chapters as well, and there were some that I almost skipped completely towards the end of the 7th volume. I'm thinking specifically of this extended arc where Kenzo Tenma, maybe we should recapitulate the plot here in a second, but that extended arc where Tenma is in jail and has to escape is kind of superfluous. I found. Did you find any of that? Did you have that experience reading it this time, or did you kind of similarly feel like the first few volumes, that these last ones, every chapter or so was more? I mean, I hate to say essential, because I'm sure there were a couple that you found inessential, but did you find for the most part that Urasawa was really making good use of these? I think they were originally published as 18 volumes, or did you find a couple chapters that you would have cut out?
That's a good question. And again, my experience in completing Monster has been a little over a year, and so I can't remember what I was feeling at the time or my experiences in terms of whether something felt like it was bogging down or maybe it was essential to the main storyline. But one of the things I do recall, in one way I would describe Urasawa's style of storytelling when it comes to these longer series. And I think you can say this even more about 20th Century Boys. And again, I'm only halfway through the signature editions that VIZ has put out. But I feel that there's something similar you can say about that as to what we're talking about now in terms of Monster. I wouldn't say that some of these storylines or side stories or tangent narratives, whatever you want to call them, are unessential. I think that what Urasawa is doing is he is extending his story world with these sometimes side narratives that may not have anything directly to do with, let's say, the main thrust of Monster. But it nonetheless adds depth. And I like to think of it in terms of maybe, I don't know if this is the most appropriate way of describing it, but Baroque storytelling. Mm-hmm. In other words, you do have a main storyline. And to recapitulate this, basically, Kenzo Tenma, who is a neurosurgeon and who is young, and he's basically a phenomenon. I mean, everyone wants to work with him. As Monster opens, there's a young boy who comes in with a head wound, a bullet to the head. And there is someone else, I think, is it the mayor? It was a major politician, isn't it? That Tenma is supposed to operate on, but then this young boy with a bullet wound to the head comes to the hospital, and Tenma realizes that he needs attention before this important politician. Mm-hmm. And so he attends to this young man who turns out to be Johann Liebert. And he's kind of ostracized for doing so, right? Because, he left aside the operation for this major politician that supports the hospital. And that doesn't bode well for, I guess, the head surgeon, who is the father of Eva, who Tenma is engaged to. But Tenma does what he thinks is right. And I think that that's important, because in the opening pages of Monster, by Tenma making that decision, he more or less defines his character, and this runs throughout the entire series, and we can talk about that in a moment. He does what he thinks is right because he feels that every life, no matter what, is as valuable as every other. This young boy that he saves, Johann, turns out to be a ruthless, soulless killer. And so Tenma feels responsible in many ways for the killings that Johann is undertaking. And in fact, the killings that Johann makes along the way are blamed on Tenma. And so Tenma, throughout most of the series, is more or less on the lam, right? He's escaping the law, and at the same time, he's trying to find Johann to get Johann to stop what he's doing. And he doesn't know exactly what he's going to do when he confronts Johann. He just knows that he needs to stop him from the killing. At the same time, Tenma is followed by a BKA Inspector Lunge. And Lunge is the kind of inspector, like Tenma is a kind of neurosurgeon. Everyone looks up to him. He can almost do no wrong. And he seems to have this uncanny ability, Lunge does, to figure out mysteries. And he is absolutely certain that Tenma is behind this series of murders that Johann commits. And so Lunge is after Tenma. And in the series, when Tenma does tell Lunge that he didn't do the killings, that the killings are by Johann Liebert, Lunge thinks that there's something mentally off about Tenma, that Johann is kind of a fantasy or an alternate personality of Kenzo Tenma. And there are, many other storylines that we undergo throughout the series, but I think that's the main premise. This dynamic between Tenma, Johann Liebert, and then Inspector Lunge. But again, I want to get back to answering your question. I know I'm going kind of long here. With all of these side stories that at least some people argue may not seem to go anywhere, don't really serve any function, I do think that they serve a function in that they, so to speak, flesh out Urasawa's story world in Monster, and it adds more, again, I'm not sure if this is the best word, but decoration, right? That's why I used the word Baroque earlier to describe the kind of storytelling that we see in Monster, and I think you could say the same thing about some of Urasawa's other longer series.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make, and kind of to tie it in with something you said about this decision that Tenma makes very early on in the series that really defines his character. And I do think that moment is important because it speaks to Urasawa's ability to build character. And I think that is this series is one of its strongest suits, is that Urasawa does take the time to really carefully build these characters, and he creates an expansive, cast of characters, or to use your terms, story world that he kind of opens up in a major way. And I do think that is one of the strengths of the series, that there are these multiple threads running through it. New characters become introduced who initially don't seem to have much significance and then end up playing a pivotal role later on. I think that stuff is some of the strongest storytelling in this series, and I think it really speaks to Urasawa's ability to carefully kind of build this story, build these characters, build these worlds over the course of I think this series originally ran for something like 7 years. So I do think there is something to be said for his almost unique ability to do that and do it well. And I want to be careful not to appear to criticize that aspect of it, because I do think, like I said, there are a number of examples of these kind of side stories that do develop into really, really interesting kind of main stories. I think the problem I have with the length of Monster isn't so much that it's long or that there's a lot of these kind of narrative threads going on, but I did find myself over and over again, especially towards the back half, and it's really just the kind of, there's a kind of conclusion to the series that seems to be protracted it a little bit, as though Urasawa knows where he's going and he knows how to get there. But there does seem to be a moment, like I mentioned, around volume 7 into volume 8, that of these perfect editions, that he does seem to be drawing that conclusion out in ways that don't really feel productive to me. So I do want to be careful not to sound like I'm criticizing the length of Monster or Urasawa's kind of propensity to build these elaborate story worlds. But I did find that there were, individual chapters here or there, or a couple in a row that really felt like he just was kind of delaying getting to that conclusion. And let me ask you, do you think that the moment you say straddling perfect volumes 7 and 8, where things seem to be unnecessarily extended, is this around the time that we really do get to see the character Peter Capek, who seems to be, I guess, the last of the big bads of this story? I think it's right around there. I think the big extended one for me was, like I said, Tenma is in jail, and there's Urasawa ends up devoting a number of chapters to this side character who's completely unrelated to Tenma, and he just involves him. Tenma gets involved in this character's story because this character is trying to break out, and he sees Tenma as a kind of useful tool to make that happen. But I do think that little arc is right around when Peter Chapek comes in. Although I'm having a hard time remembering specifically when that is.
Well, I guess it is pronounced Chapek, right? I said Capek, but
oh, I didn't catch that. Yeah, I think it's right around that point in the story.
Well, something that you said earlier is that we're introduced throughout this series, from beginning to end, to characters that at first they seem to play very, very minor roles, but then later serve a much more significant function. And it's interesting because where we left off with Volume 5, when we first talked about this in July of 2015 on that episode, I remember in the last part of that perfect Volume 5, we were introduced to two characters that at the time we had no way of knowing how significant their presence would be. But then later, both of them turned out to be quite important to the story. And I'm thinking in particular of Wolfgang Grimmer and Jan Suk. Now, Wolfgang Grimmer is, let me see, the guy who always smiles. And this is someone that Tenma meets on a train. And we learn later that Grimmer is not only he's a freelance journalist, and he's researching the 511 Kinderheim, which is the orphanage in East Germany. And there's something really off about that. But then we learn that one of the reasons why he's researching that is because he was one of the orphans who was a part of 511 Kinderheim. And so his story becomes much more significant as we get into, let's say, the next Perfect Volume 6. Same thing with Yan Suk. Yan Suk is a Prague police officer or detective. And, as we have with other instances of, let's say, Eastern European authority, there's quite a bit of corruption going on. And so Yang is surrounded by other detectives who are on the take or who are working for other individuals, underworld entities. And Suk is much more innocent. I mean, in every sense of the word, but he also has a sense of goodness in right and wrong. And his sense of right and wrong is what gets him framed later on. And so his story, after we get into, let's say, Perfect Volume 6, becomes much more significant as well. And and then his story becomes associated with that of Wolfgang Grimmer's as well. So I just use the example of Grimmer and Suk as examples of characters that when we left off, not quite 3 years ago, discussing, Perfect Volume 5 of Monster, they didn't seem to have that much significance at the time. But in subsequent volumes, yes, very much so.
Yeah. And, that was, one of the things I found, really enjoyable about these last 4 volumes in particular. In the first 5 volumes, there are a number of characters that help Tenma along the way, that he takes with him on his kind of various adventures, and he picks up or leaves at various points. But what I found really fun or exciting or interesting, maybe is the best word to use about this last 4 volume, is we start getting introduced to characters, like you said, Wolfgang Grimmer, who is, and we get, to see more and more of Detective or Inspector Lunge, and these side characters that start appearing in the back half of the series. They're not simply kind of sidekicks of Tenma's, but I found Urasawa, to be producing these characters who were fascinating in their own right, and who kind of had their own really interesting story that I would like to read about. And so like I said, Lunge and Grimmer and Suk, I think would be an example of that, where instead of Tenma collecting this cast of characters, the kind of world of Monster itself begins to be inhabited more and more by these characters who are individually really, really fascinating.
Yeah, and that's, in many ways where I was going when I made that earlier comment that Urasawa is fleshing out his story world and creating side stories that add heft to the world of Monster. And so, talking about the characters and what you just said, how you're fascinated by the lives of these characters, many of them quite minor, that are introduced throughout, again, from beginning to end. And this is, I think, yet another answer to those critics who may feel that Urasawa in his longer narratives tends to include filler that's unnecessary. I mean, I think it's definitely necessary because what Urasawa's doing is trying to create a thicker, denser narrative world. And one way of doing that is by exploring, even in a relatively minor and short way, these characters who are all unique in one way or another. Now, you also mentioned something about Inspector Lunge. Another thing that I very much appreciated about this series is the evolution of Lunge. When we first see him, he is a ruthless investigator, which I guess, if you want a good investigator, being ruthless is a positive. But we as readers know that he is wrong in accusing Tenma. And there's something very robotic about Lunge. And in fact, robotic to the point that whenever he's thinking, he moves his hands like he is inputting data into a keyboard. In fact, he even describes it that way, doesn't he? That that's his way, in kind of an imaginative way of inputting data. And so I think that lends even more of a sense of him being robotic to his character. But how he changes as the series progresses is he comes to see that he may be wrong about his assumptions. Another thing that I think changes with Inspector Lunge is we get to see him as more human. Earlier I said he's rather robotic, but we see him as more human, especially in terms of his family situation, because we learn, and I can't remember in which volume of the Perfect Editions this is, but his family is leaving him because he is married to his work and not his wife and then kids. So, I mean, that opens up a sense of empathy for this character in ways that we didn't get it before. So I think that the various changes that Inspector Lunge goes through, and even the way that he is represented to us through the lens, so to speak, of Urasawa, I think makes him much more of a sympathetic character, much more human, and as the series continues, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Lunge because I definitely found myself enjoying him more and more as the series went along. For it sounds like a number of the same reasons that you did it as well, and so I think that I definitely agree with some of Urasawa's critics that maybe there were points where he needed to be kind of edited a little more severely, but I do think there's definitely something to be said for the fact that this is a longer story, that he has more space to work with, more space to introduce characters and to develop them over a long period of time. And I think to his credit, whatever kind of faults are in his longer works as a kind of product of their length, I think, at least in my experience, has been more than made up for I think his excellent use of that space in really important ways. And I would definitely I'd be curious to read 20th Century Boys, because it sounds like that has a you mentioned Master Keaton is a little different narratively, but from what I understand, 20th Century Boys has a similar structure to Monster, in that they're both kind of driven by these overarching narratives that run from the beginning of the series to the end. So I would definitely be interested in reading that and seeing if he does similar things with character development there.
Yeah, in fact, there are quite a number of similarities between what Urasawa is doing in Monster and what he's doing in 20th Century Boys. And again, I'm only about halfway through 20th Century Boys. I think that I'm enjoying that more than Monster, and I really, really like Monster. So that tells you something about 20th Century Boys. But 20th Century Boys is a very strange narrative. I mean, the premise becomes even weirder after you get into, let's say, the first 5 VIZ signature editions. It turns into something a little different than at least I expected, and it becomes a little more unusual, but in a very good way. And as strange as Monster gets at times, it's nonetheless, I guess, realistic in terms of expectations, whereas there are elements of 20th Century Boys that are fantastical. And I don't mean fantastical in a fantasy way, right? With, elves and gnomes and whatnot. Definitely not that. But there's just a little weirdness that is going on that doesn't seem real. And also, it's in many ways a futuristic narrative, or an alternate futuristic narrative, because a lot of the action takes place, I believe it's in 2014, but it was written before 2014, and it's a 2014 that is it's a world very different from what we experienced in 2014. So yeah, I would highly recommend that. Getting back to Monster, and before we leave Monster, and I'm sure that there's some things that we may need to wrap up here. One thing that I want to say is I still don't understand why Dr. Reichwein looks so much like Wilford Brimley.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was having I opened, a few days ago, I started rereading these volumes and reading the last few, and I sat down to read it, and I opened it up and I cracked it, and I saw him, and I had completely forgotten there was a character in this book who looks like a dead ringer for Wilford Brimley. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I would be remiss if we didn't mention that on the show. But I cannot explain that for the life of me.
No. And, every time I got to that character in Monster, I would think to myself, Quaker Oats, it's the right thing to do. And, the weird thing is, in Master Keaton, and as you mentioned, it is a very different kind of series, right? Because if Monster is a long, ongoing narrative, Master Keaton, the stories hang together in a very loose way, but it's much more episodic. And so more times than not, every chapter of Master Keaton is its own standalone narrative, right? In other words, you don't need the other stories surrounding it in order to make sense of that particular chapter of Master Keaton. Now, there are some instances where there is a storyline that is 2, or let's say maybe 3 chapters long, maybe 4, but for all practical purposes, I think throughout most of the series, the various chapters are done-in-one adventures that Keaton goes through. But I mention that because in at least one of those adventures, maybe more than one from what I can recall, there is a character, and this is not Reichwein. It's a completely different person, but he looks exactly like Dr. Reichwein in Monster, who looks exactly like Wilford Brimley. So maybe Urasawa has this, fantasy, or he's allured to Wilford Brimley.
I won't, I'm not going to try and psychoanalyze Naoki Urasawa, but, he's clearly, based, obviously we've mentioned Pluto as a kind of homage to Osamu Tezuka. And I think his love of Tezuka, or his kind of at least his familiarity with Tezuka, is evident in his drawing. But my impulse response would be that maybe he's doing something akin to what Tezuka was doing with his kind of star system, where he would,
that's right, yeah,
like a troupe of actors, he would reuse the same characters in quotes, and give them a different name, and they have maybe a different personality and perform a different kind of role in the narrative, but he would reuse these faces and these bodies again and again, and so maybe Urasawa is doing something similar there.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, wasn't there one of Tezuka's characters who had a similarly big bushy mustache?
I've seen,
as Reichwein does.
I've seen I can definitely think of a number of characters in Tezuka's very early manga that's very reminiscent of 20s and 30s cartoons, very rounded, very classically kind of Disney cartoony. And I can think of a couple characters in those works who have a perfectly round head and no hair, and they do have that kind of broomstick mustache, but I don't know if they look quite as much like as Wilford Brimley as Dr. Reichwein does in Monster.
Well, Shea, you want to move on to the other title that you and I recently completed?
Yeah, let's move on to Otherworld Barbara.
Yes, Otherworld Barbara, and Volume 2 was released in August of last year. And, both of us got a copy of Otherworld Barbara Volume 2, and we knew we wanted to discuss it on the show, but we didn't know exactly when. And so that's when we got the idea, I think late last year, that maybe we should do a show where we follow up on maybe 2 or 3 series that we actually did keep up with, Otherworld Barbara being one of those. Now, this is by Moto Hagio, and Fantagraphics is the publisher of both the first and the second volume. Again, we originally reviewed the first volume of Otherworld Barbara in September of 2016, and now we have the second volume. Maybe let's start off with me asking you this question. Now that you've read the second volume of Otherworld Barbara, has your feelings or your perception of the story, the overall story of Otherworld Barbara, your experiences with that first volume, have they changed at all now with this second volume?
That's a really good question. There were definitely parts of the second volume that, while I was reading it, really stood out to me as not really working as forcefully as the first volume, but thinking about the first volume kind of after the second one. I think, like I mentioned, I see when you post things on Goodreads, and I saw that you, after reading the second volume, kind of went back and reread the first and found the, maybe more, I don't know, what's a good word to use? Maybe hokier elements or, more kind of soap
operatic. Yeah.
I noticed you said that you found those more pronounced, and I don't know if I would find them more pronounced. I definitely do think that now that I know how kind of Hagio wraps up her stories, I do think that there's maybe too many threads going on. I think she's got maybe one too many mysteries converging in this second volume that originate in the first. And I definitely do think that if she had kept it a little simpler, that first volume, thinking about it in light of this second one, I think that would be maybe how my reading of that first volume would change, because I definitely liked the first volume, and while there's definitely awareness that she's juggling a lot of balls in that first volume, I was pretty confident that she would be able to resolve them all satisfyingly, and I gotta say, I did find the resolution or the explanation of how some of these mysteries that we were introduced into in that first volume, I didn't find the resolution of those quite as satisfying as I had wanted to and had kind of expected to. But what about you? I've mentioned kind of how I've seen your reading change a little bit, but can you expand on that a little bit more for listeners?
Yeah. You mentioned what I had written on Goodreads. Actually, what I did is, before reading the second volume of Otherworld Barbara, I went back to reread the first. Okay. Because, again, it had been not quite 2 years since I had read the first book, so I needed to refresh myself on that. And I recall when we read and discussed Otherworld Barbara Volume 1 in September of 2016, I really liked that. And I even think on Goodreads I gave it 5 stars. But it's curious. When I went back to reread Book 1 again, in preparation for reading Volume 2, I was less moved than I was the first time. And I didn't feel that the story was as successful as I initially did. And, that could be nothing more than just being somewhat familiar with something. And so my first time around, it is brand new. It's something that I've never seen before. It's a narrative that I'm plunging into for the first time. So, of course, it's going to have an impact on me that's different from, let's say, a second or even a third reading. But I didn't think much about my different experience in reading the first book the second time around. But reading Volume 2, I did get the sense, as you mentioned, that it was a little soap opera-like in places. And I know that Hagio is, I don't want to call a sentimental writer, but I think sentimental may be a good way of describing what she does. I mean, I'm familiar with her Heart of Thomas, and that is a very sentimental work as well. But Heart of Thomas is different than the kind of story that we see unfolding over the now 2 volumes of Otherworld Barbara. And so I guess it's not like maybe I didn't expect it to be that way, or maybe I didn't want it to be that way. But definitely in this second volume of Otherworld Barbara, I felt that there were a lot of emotional storylines that were being played out, that character reaction in places were over-exaggerated. And again, I know that there's something about that kind of sentimental-like narrative that appeals to readers. I'm not one of those readers. And so there are certain things that happened, especially toward the end of this second volume of the Otherworld Barbara, that were bugging me in ways that I wasn't bugged by the first volume. And I just felt that by the time I got to the last fifth, maybe, of the second volume of Otherworld Barbara, I was getting tired of the story. I mean, really, I was getting tired of it. And I read through it quicker than I think I normally read through narratives, because I wanted it to get over with. I mean, obviously I wanted to see the very end, but also I was getting maybe a tad annoyed, and it could have been just my state of mind at the time. Who knows? But I did feel that it was getting a little too over dramatic for my taste.
You know, that's interesting that you had such a strong reaction. You know, I tend to enjoy, you know, there's something about, like you said, the kind of soap operatic elements of Moto Hagio's work, but that kind of mode of storytelling that is, it's invested in these very, maybe loud is the appropriate word I want to describe the kind of emotions that, or the way that Hagio is depicting these emotions. It's like she's turned her amp up to 11, and you know, it is, and so I think sentimental is a kind of, it's a good, I think it's a good word to use with the caveat to listeners that we're not using it in a pejorative sense necessarily, but I do think it is accurate because she is very concerned with emotions, and so I think that's a fair description of kind of aesthetic and of this book in particular. But I find myself really drawn to those elements because there's something about, there's just a kind of extremity to storytelling when emotions are kind of played at that volume that I find interesting. But what I mean, I'd like to, you know, because you did have a strong reaction to those elements that I wasn't expecting. So I would like to hear a little bit more. Was there like a particular narrative thread that you found, or a particular relationship, or a particular scenario that you found was just maybe too sentimental or too maybe emotional for its own sake, rather than in pursuit of some narrative purpose, or anything like that?
You know, I did feel that in the second volume, the relationship between Tokoi and Kiria was becoming a little over dramatic compared to what it was in the first volume. And for those readers who may not be familiar with Otherworld Barbara, or maybe haven't read, let's say, the first volume in a while, Tokoi is, I guess you could call, our protagonist, and he is an individual whose job is to enter people's dream worlds for any multitude of reasons, right? So it could be that he's entering a dream world or entering someone's unconscious state like a criminal, in order to find out where literally the bodies are buried, or why someone did what he or she did. In the case of Otherworld Barbara, he enters the dream state of Alba, who is I think she's a teenager, right? When she is dreaming. And she has been unconscious and apparently dreaming for years. And researchers are monitoring her, and they're uncertain what's going on with her and why she won't wake up. And so in the first volume of Otherworld Barbara, Tokoi goes into Alba's dream world, and it is a completely different realm, about 100 years in their future where the story takes place, in a realm called Barbara. It's an island that is called Barbara. And Tokoi learns that Barbara is also this imaginary space that his estranged son, Kiria, has created. And so in the first volume, one of the big mysteries is, what is this connection between Alba and Kiria? And I think that plays out quite nicely in volume 1. We get more of it in volume 2, but the thing in the second volume, again, to answer your question, that seemed to me a little overwrought was this relationship between Tokoi and Kiria, because Tokoi, especially, well, we first get this in the first volume. He regrets the fact that he didn't pay attention to Kiria as much as he should have, and he is his son, and he feels that he is his lost son because Tokoi didn't pay attention to him as he needed to, as he should have, and he regrets that. And so throughout the series, Tokoi is wanting to get back and connect to Kiria, but at least in the first volume, Kiria is kind of resistant to that, and part of that resistance is also based on Tokoi's ex-wife. Oh God, what is her name? Akemi. And Akemi is really out to get Tokoi and tells Kiria to stay away from his father. In fact, at one point, Akemi even says, Tokoi is not your father. The thing in volume 2 that I got tired of after a while is this over-emotional, overwrought relationship between father-son, in that Tokoi at times breaks into tears because he's so distraught that he's not connected to his son like he would like to be. Now, Kiria does, in some ways, kind of relent and become closer to his quote-unquote father. And I'm not going to go on to describe what I mean by quote unquote, because this is where things start to become a little complex and convoluted, especially in volume 2. But I think the over emotional reactions of Tokoi at times, I just felt, we got this again. Let's just get over it. And again, I understand that, Hagio is this kind of storyteller, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that my experience reading the second volume, and maybe again it was my state of mind, I just was getting tired of that. So that's one example of, I think, a relationship that seemed rather overdramatic or melodramatic that kind of pressed my buttons.
Yeah, I definitely see your point, and I can think of some of the moments that you're talking about, and yeah, I do think that, my reaction to the second volume, especially the closer we got to the end of it, was that it did feel a little rushed. And so I am curious if you think, I think that, had Hagio maybe a little more space to work with, she could have maybe taken her time a little bit more with some of the plot points, and I'm curious if maybe you feel that way about that relationship between Tokoi and Kiria that you were just kind of explicating. Do you think that maybe you were tired of the way that Hagio was rendering these emotions or writing these emotions because the arc of that relationship was fairly condensed, especially in, the first half of this, of volume 2. I found, their relationship changing very, very quickly. And so do you think if maybe she had taken her time a little bit more with, exploring that relationship and you were able to see it develop, over maybe a longer period of time, that you would have felt differently about how she was writing that relationship? Or do you really think it was just the nature of some of those emotional states that she was writing?
I think both. I think that at times, the way that I read it, over emotional reaction to some of the characters kind of got to me at times. I also think that there was something about Kiria that I don't want to say is two-dimensional, but I didn't feel like I really knew the character that well. And so that change, that shift in volume 2 that you mentioned between father-son, that seemed kind of abrupt. You're right.
Yeah.
It seemed to almost come out of nowhere after for so long Kiria resisting Tokoi, to all of a sudden apparently relent and feel close to the guy that feels is his father. It just seemed a little too sudden. So maybe if we had gotten a little more complexity, or had seen more facets of Kiria, see him grow more and understand him better, we can empathize and understand that relationship better. I don't want to say that the character Kiria is a plot device and that's it, because I don't think that that's the case. But I think to some degree, you could argue that Kiria functions more as a plot device than as a fully fleshed out character, especially when we see the purposes that he's put to in relation to another character in the book, Taka. And this is someone who is on the island of Barbara in this dream world. And there's, one of the things I do appreciate, though, about Otherworld Barbara is this theme of doubling. And I can't remember, but we probably mentioned this on that original show back in September of 2016. I remember when we looked at the first volume.
Mentioning, was it Puddinhead Wilson when we were talking about it?
I mentioned Puddinhead Wilson? That's all about twinning as well. Yeah, and there is a lot of twinning that's going on in Otherworld Barbara. I mean, we do have the aforementioned Kiria and Taka. We also have Ezra Strati and Johann Sira, and as well we have, I guess, Ezra and Pine. Let me see. There's also, Paris and Pine. We can go on with these various doubles that keep occurring throughout. And then, of course, there's the Alba who is the dream Alba, and then there's the Alba who is dreaming. And I think, even though they're the same character in many ways, they're nonetheless twins, one of the other, in terms of the way that they're represented. So there's a lot of this going on. You could even argue that Tokoi is a double to some degree of a Kemi, because they seem to be kind of a yin and yang in terms of their relationship.
Yeah,
And then there's Jujo Nanami, and we have Nanami, who is an older woman, but then there are occasions in both volumes 1 and 2 where she is either given some kind of rejuvenation drug, or the drug that's already in her activates again, and she becomes a young woman, but she goes by, and I can't remember the name she goes by, but it's a completely different name than Nanami.
It's Marion Bad.
Marion Bad, that's right.
Because she, it's a reference to Last Year at Marion Bad, which is, I'm still, maybe I could think through how Last Year at Marion Bad is related. It's a reference that is very explicit, but it doesn't really make it takes some work to understand, I think, what Hagio is doing with that reference.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, and in fact, doesn't Nanami or Myriabad make that reference outright to Tokoi in that first volume?
Yeah, I think she makes a joke about it, and he doesn't know what she's talking about. Like most people who don't watch very weird French movies about memory and time. But like you said, there's to get back to your original point, there is a lot of doubling and even in a couple cases of tripling, that, I think there's something really, Hagio is going for something very specific when she does that and repeats that, which I think is evidenced by, the kind of overtness with which she does it and the centrality to the narrative of these things. but I'm not entirely sure if I've got a good reading of why she is doing some of this stuff with doubling and twinning that you mentioned. Did you have a conclusion that you would like to draw, or?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a conclusion to the whole doubling or twinning, but I do think that it has something to do with some of the larger themes in the book, which can be kind of, I guess, convoluted at times. And in fact, in many ways, when and I'm not giving anything away here, but when we get toward the end of the second volume of Otherworld Barbara, we get a clearer sense of what's going on here. And Hagio is playing around not only with dream space and memory, but also with past, present, and future, and how one informs the other. Now, it's one thing to say that the past informs the present and then the future. That makes sense. But to say that the present, especially in terms of the dreamscape, determines the future, and then the future almost like reactively goes back to influence what happens in the past, it becomes almost like a temporal Mobius strip is one way that I was looking at it.
I was thinking it's I wasn't until you started talking about it in these kind of terms, but it seems to me, and I'm sure this is not where she's getting it, but it seems to me to be kind of like Hegel's kind of conception of history, where this future point is kind of pulling the kind of present towards it in this way. Though I'm sure she's, riffing on something from Isaac Asimov or, one of those guys, and not Hegel. Because like a normal person, I'm sure she has not read Hegel.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is it's a weird game she's playing with time in this.
And that's the thing. That's one of the things that really fascinates me about Otherworld Barbara, the entire series. Now, I know we started off with me not necessarily bashing Otherworld Barbara, but me reacting, I guess, somewhat negatively to the melodramatic aspects of it. And I don't want our listeners to think that I don't like Otherworld Barbara. I do. It's just there are parts of it, especially in the second volume, that rubbed me the wrong way at times. But I think that some of the deeper issues that Hagio is undertaking in this longer story, Otherworld Barbara, I think are quite ambitious, and part of that is time, memory, dream space, all those things that we've been discussing, the thematic issues. And the twinning and the doubling I'm absolutely fascinated by. So, just because I didn't like some of the over-emotional aspects or the sentimental facets of Otherworld Barbara doesn't mean I don't like Otherworld Barbara.
Yeah, I mean, I have mentioned a couple times in the last few minutes that I wasn't, it didn't end quite as satisfactorily as I had hoped and had wanted. Because, like you mentioned as well, I do think she's got so much going on that I think at points it becomes a little convoluted or maybe a little over complicated. But, like you, while I do have kind of my reservations about various moments in the series, I really enjoyed it as well, and I was really taken with how she was able to explore these. Like you mentioned, she's dealing with these very complicated, very weighty ideas and themes, and she's able to explore them in a really interesting sci-fi world. And there's always something to be said for an enjoyable, fun sci-fi comic that also, really seriously tries to explore these big questions. And it doesn't hurt that Hagio is a terrific cartoonist, and I just, certain points of the comic were just a thrill to read, just solely because of how well she was drawing them.
Well, Shea, now we definitely knew that we wanted to discuss Monster and then Otherworld Barbara because we both had completed those series. But, when we were talking about the idea for this show, there were other titles that we were speculating about. Do we want to discuss these series as well? What have we been keeping up with? And so let's take the last few minutes of this episode to talk about maybe some other series that each of us, maybe not both of us, but each of us have either completed or have tried to keep up with in some way or another. Of the things that we've been reading over these past several years, because again, whenever you and I look at the first 1 or 2 volumes of what's going to be an ongoing series, we tell each other, yes, I will, or I don't know if I will continue with it. And more times than not, we do say, yeah, we want to continue with it. Which other titles, in addition to Monster and Otherworld Barbara, may you have been keeping up with?
I have been really bad about keeping up with the series, and that's for a number of reasons. Nothing to do with the quality, but there are a couple of series like Goodnight Pun Pun or Assassination Classroom, One Punch Man, and I think a couple others that I did continue to read and to follow kind of sporadically since we recorded the episode where whatever episode we happen to talk about these series in, I continue to enjoy them, and I still plan to go back and actually fully catch up on these. But I have not been very good about staying kind of current with any of these series, but I know you've done a little bit of a better job than me. Well, what about you? What series have you followed through on keeping up with?
Well, there's a whole slew that I would like to have kept up with, and I still intend to get caught up with, but I just haven't had the time yet. I know one that really stands out, and this is one of this year's Eisner nominees, is Golden Kamuy. I think we have the 4th volume out, and the 5th one is about to come out. I need to fish out, I can't find it, but I need to fish out my first volume of Golden Kamuy that we discussed last year and reread that and then get into those other volumes because I definitely want to read Golden Kamuy. I also want to catch up with Platinum End because I really enjoyed that series as well. Also, Sweet Blue Flowers. And we discussed that not that long ago. But I know that volume 3 is already out, and I really enjoyed that. You mentioned Assassination Classroom. That's one that over the years, I've been getting the volumes. I just haven't had the opportunity or I haven't taken the opportunity to read them. And I know that is wrapping up now, the series in English. But there are other titles as well that I would like to keep up with and go back and catch up. Like, for instance, Happiness, definitely Battle Angel Alita, which we discussed not that long ago, and Oh My Goddess, which is one of the earlier books that we looked at. The first, I think, omnibus of that. But one series that I absolutely did finish is Inio Asano's Goodnight Pun Pun. You mentioned that a second ago. I know that 2 years ago when we did our best of 2016 episode, Goodnight Pun Pun was one of those titles that I put in my top 10. And to tell you how much I enjoyed that series, in last year's 2017's best of episode for the Comics Alternative, I also included Goodnight Pun Pun. And by that point, the last volume in English, number 7, had come out. And, I really enjoy, well, first and foremost, Inio Asano's work. I think I've read about all of his stuff that's been translated so far, I think. And he is one of those creators, like Urasawa, I would say, that I am absolutely on board for, no matter what he does. And in fact, kind of as a teaser for our listeners, on our May episode, which should come out in a few more weeks, we're going to be talking about Inio Asano again.
Yes, and I
a
have
new work
seen,
of his. But
I've seen some pages from it, and I'm very excited to to read it and to talk with you about it.
Yes. But Goodnight Pun Pun was absolutely fascinating. It is one of those series where you do see a character grow. And I don't know if I would call it a Künstlerroman because I don't know if I would call Pun Pun an artist figure, but he definitely has a sensibility of an artist, I think. You could argue. And so maybe it is a pseudo Künstlerroman, if you want to call it that. But with each volume, you do get to see him growing up in a different part of his life. And I think it ends when he's still a relatively young man. But he does change significantly. So the Pun Pun that we see toward the end of the final volume, number 7, is quite different from that little fella that we saw in the first volume. And he does go through various relationships and heartbreaks. And so we do get to see him grow through things that at times are very painful. And I really appreciated that. And that's one of the things about Asano's writing is that he can give you the inside of a character, what's going on with this individual, and write that individual, male or female, in such a way that we can't help but empathize with them. And so when they have something joyous going on in their life, we feel joyous. When they have something painful happen to them, we feel that pain. And I think Goodnight Pun Pun is a great example of that. One of the favorite manga that I've read in my life. I mean, it really was a great series. So that's one series that I definitely finished up. One that I haven't finished up because we're not finished with it yet, but I have been keeping up with it as the volumes are released, is Hanazawa's I Am a Hero. And if you remember, this came out from Dark Horse. I think the first volume came out maybe 2.5, maybe not quite 2.5 years ago. And when you and I discussed that first volume of I Am a Hero, I remember making the comment that, this was being billed as a zombie manga. And I thought after that first volume that it was much more than a zombie narrative. In fact, it wasn't a zombie narrative at all. And I thought that was just kind of a marketing ploy, or how people were kind of too easily trying to describe what I Am a Hero is about. But I do have to admit that once I got into the second volume, I did get the sense, okay, this is a zombie narrative that we're going through here. Because I thought that Hanazawa was going to kind of zag when he, in fact, zigged in terms of this whole zombie thing. But no, I Am a Hero has turned into a straight-out zombie apocalypse narrative. And I'm not saying that that's a thing that I don't necessarily like. I do enjoy this, and I think that it's a strong narrative. Now, in the most recent volume that came out, is it 4? I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it's 5. Yes, 5 is the one that's most recently out, because 6 is about to come out. In 5, we're introduced to more characters that kind of take us away from our protagonist, Hideo Suzuki. And Suzuki is, I don't know if you remember much about his character, but he is fun. He tries to be heroic. And he's kind of a bumbler in many ways, but he does make his way in this zombie apocalyptic world. And I think he's someone that I enjoy reading. And so one of the things that struck me about the most recent volume that came out, I don't know, maybe a few months ago, volume 5, the omnibus from Dark Horse, I'm curious because we're starting to get new characters enter this narrative world, and I'm wondering if this will in some way be a marginalization of Suzuki, the protagonist, or not. And so I'm looking forward to see what happens in volume 6. So that's another series that we've read in the past that I've been keeping up with. And one that I haven't been as diligently keeping up with, but I've read some of, is Hikishimura's Princess Jellyfish. Remember when we discussed the first volume of Princess Jellyfish?
I believe it was on the same episode as I Am a Hero.
Was that the same episode? Wow.
I think so.
You may be right there. But, I really liked Princess Jellyfish, and it was a kind of story that I didn't think that I would like, and I don't know why I didn't think I would like it. But I ended up really enjoying that, and I remember making that one of my honorable mentions for, I think it was the 2016 best of episode for the Comics Alternative. And so in reading subsequent volumes 2 and then into 3 now, I feel the same. It's a really good story. It's something that I would highly recommend, and I do plan on eventually finishing it up. And I think pretty soon, if not already, we're going to get the publication of the final omnibus volume of Princess Jellyfish, and I think that's 8, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and I think she's got Akiko.
Oh, she's got a new series that's coming out.
Series, yeah, that I've heard good things about. So
yes, and it's something that I think you and I will probably discuss on a future episode.
Hopefully. I liked Princess Jellyfish, so
yeah. Oh, yeah. This new series is Tokyo Tarareba Girls. Tokyo Tarareba Girls. Yes.
You know, I could threaten our listeners with, one day I'll catch up with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and we'll do a catch up episode of the 800 volumes of that series.
That's another one that I would like to go back and catch up on, but I just have not taken the time to do so.
Yeah, especially since with that one, there really are, 4 dozen volumes at this point.
Yeah, although I feel that when I read that, I will be in the mood to Vogue.
Well, then, Inio Asano, or not Inio Asano. God, I'm blanking on the name of who writes JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. But that series is doing its job, then, if it makes you want to Vogue.
Because so many of the characters... Oh, Araki.
Yes, Hirohiko Araki.
Hirohiko Araki, yeah. So there you go. Shea and I catching up on 2 series that we had started previously on episodes of the monthly manga series. We started off by discussing our completion of Naoki Urasawa's Monster, put out by VIZ Media. And then we discussed the second of 2 volumes of Moto Hagio's Otherworld Barbara, which came out through Fantagraphics. And then we wrapped up by talking about other things that we've been trying to either successfully or unsuccessfully to keep up with. I know these are only monthly episodes, Shea, but we read a damn lot of manga.
Yeah, when you think about it, you think about reading maybe a couple volumes a month. It doesn't seem like that much, but when you go back and you think about how long you've been doing it, and how many you read every episode, it does add up. We end up reading a lot of manga.
Yes. And if you want to find great prices on manga like we discuss on the Comics Alternative monthly series, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there you will find incredible discounts on manga every single month. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this month's, or actually April's, episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And you can email us. You can email the show at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can email me directly at shay@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, what is your email address?
Derek@comicsalternative.com. Neat how that works, huh? You can find us also on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. A lot of ways for people to get in touch with us.
Yes, they're going to have to start inventing new social media platforms for us.
Yeah, well, that's more for me to keep up with, so I don't know about that. But Shea and I will be back at the end of the month for our May manga episode, so listen up for that. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
Take care.